אין שבוע מתאים יותר לדיון הזה, יותר מאשר האוטו-דפה שעשו בבני ברק, לפאות.
אבל אני לא אדבר על הפיות, אלא אם כן אתה רוצה.
לא, אני רק אומר שזה אולי סימפטום.
בשבוע הבא ידברו על הפיות של הסינים, מפני שזה אותו דבר.
יש כבר פסקים נגדיים
נגד
מעבר לים, וחושבים שהרב אלישיב מושפע על ידי יצרן פיות סינתטיות.
יכול להיות, מפני שאחרת הם יצטרכו לדעת על כל פיה ופיה, האם זאת שהייתה, השערות שלהם היא הייתה משהו, עובדת זרה.
Okay, it's a great pleasure of having you all here. It's a long time we haven't had a luncheon meeting, so we return to our old intimate activities. I just want to make, before welcoming Professor Sam Heilman, I want to make two announcements. On the 13th of July we'll have Gary Rosenblatt here, the editor of the Jewish Week.
Saw him 2 days ago,
Yeah? And he'll essentially speak about as far as we have agreed about what Israeli politicians understand and don't understand in the United States. And before that, on the 28th of June, we have a full-day symposium with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, I think in Hebrew and in English, devoted to the issue of the increasing gap, abyss between Europe and Israel, with speakers partly from abroad, partly from Israel. That will not be here, that will be in the building of Konrad Adenauer Foundation at Mishkenot Shalani. For those of you who haven't seen our last publications, we have this publication of the interview with Daniel Pipes on the end of the golden era of American Jewry, which he thinks that has now come, that American Jewry will have a more difficult future than it had recent decades. It's now a pleasure to introduce Professor Sam Heilman, who for most of you doesn't need much introduction because he's everywhere now known as the great expert on ultra-orthodoxy, in particular in the United States. I'm very glad he has published with us. He has published at least in one of the Pew books, as far as I recall. Professor Heilman will speak for about half an hour, and then the floor is open, not as usual only for questions, but also for remarks, as we last year did on the luncheons we had on propaganda. The increasing influence of ultra-orthodoxy on modern orthodoxy in the United States. Professor Sam Heilman.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and such a distinguished audience. I'm a little bit reluctant to tell you things that I'm sure many of which you already know. But what I was asked to talk about today is what I generally would call mixed language titled The Haredization of Modern Orthodoxy, or what I call in my forthcoming book, The Rise and Fall of American Modern Orthodoxy. And in particular, I wanted to focus this afternoon on what I see as some of the factors that have accounted for this religious move to the right on the part of modern Orthodoxy. And I want to focus in particular on the institution of the yeshiva and the day school, and talk about what I think have been the structural factors that have led to this move to the right. I'm going to dispense with some of the things that I think are probably familiar to you, although we can certainly discuss them in the give and take afterwards. I was amused when you say you don't have to ask only questions, you can make statements. In the Jewish audience, that always happens anyway, so there's really no need to say that.
We control the place decently.
Yeah. Okay. what I normally begin with, and what I am dispensing with here, is a definition of fundamentalism. Just to say, berashei tevot, that what fundamentalism essentially does, and certainly fundamentalism, which is a term that originally comes from a Christian context, particularly a Protestant context in the United States, is a term that has come to be used for a whole variety of other religions that have fundamentalist-like movements or variants. That the fundamentalist view is that there is a single truth, that the people who share this truth are tied in an unbroken chain to the past. Of course, it is not only a traditional movement, it is much more a traditionalist movement, meaning that it makes use of a reinvented, selectively retrieved past to suggest that those selectively aspects of tradition that are emphasized are unchanged. They, of course, are not unchanged. It's very much a modern movement. And it suggests that it alone is in possession of the truth, and that it must fight back against forces in the contemporary world that seek to undermine, or a word that is very commonly used, or a concept that's very commonly used, to defile the world as they see it. And there are a variety of fundamentalist points of view. One we might call active fundamentalism, where the single unifying aspect of active fundamentalism is a desire to fight back in an aggressive way, to take the battle to the enemy and engage not only in a fight against the enemy, but in some cases to try to completely obliterate that enemy for a variety of reasons. Sometimes fundamentalists become active because they believe that they have no choice, that the enemy is at their gates coming into their world. They can't keep the enemy out, and so they're forced to fight back. Or they may become actively fundamentalist, actively and aggressively engaged in the culture war because they think that the enemy is weak and that this is an opportunity to finally finish the enemy off. And then there is a second kind of fundamentalism, which we could call a kind of quiescent or passive fundamentalism, which believes that we are in possession of the truth, that the alternative way of living is dangerous for us, but that alternative is ultimately doomed, and so all we have to do is to protect ourselves, insulate ourselves from becoming defiled by it, and in good time, history will develop in such a way, and we, of course, as fundamentalists, we always know the end of history. It will develop in a particular way that if we are patient and wait for the end which we know is coming, that the others will simply disappear. So that we don't have to take the fight to them, we just have to hold on to our own and make sure that we're not undermined and in some way corroded by the influences around us. The last point I would make, just in the way of introduction, is that this kind of fundamentalist struggle is at the heart of fundamentalism. That is, there must be an enemy. Fundamentalists are much better in fighting against something rather than simply defining what it is they stand for. And that is why it's not at all unusual to find them living in the midst, surrounded by their enemies. It is much more difficult to carry on this fundamentalist struggle if you can't perceive the other. The other is a very important part of this. It's not surprising that, at least in the case of Jewish fundamentalism, we find it occurring in two of the really precincts of modernity and anti-fundamentalism, in a sense, the modern West, and in the case of Israel, the modern Western enclave of the secular Israeli state. So much in the way of introduction. Perhaps the last point to make is that it remains an open question and a matter of debate whether fundamentalism is better nurtured in an open and liberal democratic environment where they have the liberal democratic alternative to fight against, or whether they do better in a totalitarian environment. And I think the answer is really a combination of the two. You need a liberal democratic environment for fundamentalism to organize itself. But once in power, it does much better in a totalitarian environment. And at the same time, when it is in a totalitarian environment, that may, to some extent, spell its end. I think one of the more interesting cases to look at as a kind of paradigm of how it grows and how it can begin to fall apart is to look at the Iranian case. But that's beyond the discussion today. Well, clearly behind what I want to say is that I believe that there are Jewish variants of fundamentalism. There is active fundamentalism, there is quiescent fundamentalism, and then there is a kind of fundamentalism that swings between these two extremes. And we can talk about examples perhaps later in the diyun, in the question and statement period. But now I want to focus on, in particular, two models of Jewish education which in a sense represent both a fundamentalist variant and an alternative to fundamentalism within the American Orthodox world. There are institutions that, of course, you're all familiar with. For shorthand purposes, we'll call one the day school, which is the American modern Orthodox, in a sense, invention, great innovation in Jewish education, and the other is the yeshiva. They begin sort of from the same wellhead, because the term yeshiva was, and in some cases still is, used for day schools, but by and large they are different. And without going into all the details, because I'm sure they're familiar to this audience, just a few essential differences, it seems to me. That in the yeshiva, the outlook suggests that above all knowledge is Torah learning. Torah learning is really the purpose of the yeshiva. The yeshiva is viewed, particularly in America, has been viewed as an instrument for Jewish continuity, and as a kind of, and a term that is used very often by people who speak about yeshivas, as a bastion, as a fortress, as a protective and insulated environment in which Torah Judaism, whatever that means, can grow. And although there are secular or general studies in the yeshiva, they're there not because they're viewed as having any particular ontological value or even pedagogic value. May have a pedagogic value of a very limited sort. They're secondary in importance. If they're taught, they're often taught in the afternoon. They're taught quickly. In a sense, they're not given a kind of high level of value or importance. But Torah learning is primary. That's by and large the yeshiva model. It's based upon a worldview that suggests that the only insurance for Jewish continuity is learning Torah. And it's the kind of environment that evolved into what Menachem Friedman here has called the Scholars' Society. You know it very well. I don't need to talk about it further at this point. The day school essentially tried to evolve what I would call a kind of stance of stabilized dualism. The day school idea emerges out of the modern Orthodox worldview that said, or that argued at least, certainly in the post-Holocaust period, that the best way to assure Jewish continuity was not to be insular, since that certainly hadn't guaranteed Jewish continuity in Europe, but that the best way to guarantee Jewish continuity was to have a foot in both worlds, and that while Torah was important and ritual observance was important and maintaining a strong loyalty and fidelity to Jewish values and learning was critical, that it alone was not sufficient for the Jewish people, that there was an ontological and educational value to what we would call today a liberal arts education, and that that education was second to nothing, that it had it emerged out of a value that already had become important in Western Europe and Germany. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Torah and Derech Eretz approach. These are then the two models that existed. The day school in America was in effect the institution that represented modern Orthodoxy. And so if we want to look at the extent to which haredization, or an increase in a religious right-wing view, has entered into American life, what we want to look at is the changing emphasis or the changing character of both the day school and the yeshiva over time in the United States. Now, my argument is that the day school has, in a sense, succeeded but also failed, and that there is a growing tendency, in part because of the structure of the way things evolved and developed in American Jewish education or Orthodox education. There is a process which has moved the day school closer and closer to the yeshiva, and it has given the yeshiva, even in America, a life that no one could have predicted in the immediate post-World War II period. I think there are four factors that we can see that account for the decline, or to some extent, maybe the better word is the failure of nerve of the day school. And those four factors are really four and a half, four factors. One is the perceived, and I'll talk about each of these briefly, the perceived decline of American culture that occurred during the late 1960s and 1970s and really into the present. The second, the professionalization of day school education to an extent that led to the complete handover by the family of the responsibility of Jewish education to the schools. Third, the changing nature of Judaica faculty in the day schools, and in particular the changing nature of those who became Orthodox rabbis, who are also an important part of that faculty. And along with that, we have to add a sort of secondary element, which is the changing nature of women's roles in Orthodox Jewish life. And finally, the emergence of study in Israeli yeshivas and women's seminaries or midrashot as an essential experience in Orthodox education for American Jews. So let's just look at these four factors very briefly, and I'll speak telegraphically because I really do want to open it to you. The perceived decline of American culture, I think, is pretty obvious. Behind the day school ideal, behind modern Orthodoxy, was the assumption that becoming part of American culture and society was a good thing. It was an open society. It promised all sorts of things that no other society and culture seemed to have offered in the past. It came on the heels of this terrible experience of the diaspora, the end of the diaspora in a sense, or what seemed to be the end of the diaspora in Europe brought about by the Holocaust. And so American culture seemed to be the dream, and the day school was going to be the way of entering into that dream without necessarily having to sacrifice Orthodox ideals. But American society and culture represented, which had once represented a positive model, suddenly, by the late 1960s and into the 70s, presented a much more troublesome model. Not only did the value of that culture become a matter of question with the radicalization of American culture and society, but at the same time, many of the schools, and part of what the day schools were involved in, and one of the important ways in which day schools were able to sell themselves to their modern Orthodox clientele, was their success, not so much in producing graduates who observed Torah and who kept kashrut and who didn't intermarry. That may have been the case, but the way that the day schools primarily were able to sell themselves was in their success in getting young people into not only college, but the best colleges and universities in America. And with that, the promise of everything that America was going to offer. The problem was that by the late 1960s and early 1970s, those very colleges were the places where radicalization occurred in great measure. Those were precisely the places where the entry into American society and culture occurred, but they occurred in such a way that the America that these young people were entering into wasn't exactly what their Orthodox parents had bargained for. And they began to have some doubts whether this strategy was really going to lead to Jewish continuity. At the same time, already by the 1970s, what we today call haredi orthodoxy, which in the beginning, in the early 1950s, seemed to be on its last legs, an opinion that was shared both here and in America, turned out not to be on its last legs at all, was becoming much more self-confident, and was telling these same parents who were having doubts about America, you see, we told you so, that this is a recipe for disaster, that your step into the other world was a step down the slippery slope of assimilation, decline, and so on and so forth. You need more Jewish insurance. If you share our view that Orthodox continuity is important, then you have to recognize you have made the wrong decision about keeping one foot in the American society and one foot in the Orthodox world. The two can't go together. They are poles apart. And in fact, there was a kind of restraint, a kind of pulling back, and that is a feeling that has grown over the last 25 years, that maybe going to college and sharing in the American dream might not be an unmixed blessing for Orthodoxy. So, in a way, to respond to that, what we'll see is the day schools began to adopt more and more of the yeshiva model, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Second factor, which I mentioned, which was the handover of education from the family to the schools. So long as Jewish education, of course, as I don't have to tell you, is viewed as a parental responsibility. Certainly, V'shinantam levanecha is not an empty phrase, it's a creedal idea. Jewish education was viewed as a responsibility of family and community. However, one of the aspects of modern orthodoxy in the modern world is what the sociologist Max Weber once called strict specialization. Most modern Jews in America, and in this I would include modern Orthodox Jews, view rabbis and teachers as specialists, professionals. And they go to them for their specialized and professional needs. Once the day school was created as an institution, and once its establishment was firm, by and large, modern Orthodox parents in particular, abandoned their role in the education of their children. They basically said, my responsibility is to make sure that I have the best day school that I can have. But once that occurs, the actual education of my children is done by these professionals. And it's done from the earliest age possible through the end of high school. This was particularly useful for the modern Orthodox because they were more and more entering into professional careers themselves. And it's no secret that the day school provides a very neat way of, in a sense, covering the needs that they have to take care of their children. For a time, the Jewish education in those day schools was carried out by women who were part of the modern Orthodox world. However, as the role of modern Orthodox women changed, and as they were gaining the same kind of professional expertise as the men, there was no longer a need for them to remain in Jewish education. And even today, the most popular fields for modern Orthodox young women is no longer to be a teacher, but to be, anybody know?
Judge.
No, not a judge in America. Social worker, but also therapists. They love being occupational therapists, speech therapists, not so much physical therapists because you have to touch other people, but speech therapy and occupational therapy are very big in the modern Orthodox world. So, as a result, they were giving over their children to these professionals, and the teachers then, the Judaica teachers in particular, became the key to Jewish transmission. Moreover, whatever those teachers said, the parents were now forced, they were in a kind of iron cage, forced to accept the worldview, the demands of those teachers, even if they didn't personally agree with them, because after all, we hired them, we're sending our children there, so what your Rebbe says to you, you have to do. Third factor, and this really dovetails particularly with this second factor, was the changing nature of the faculty in the day schools. Given that modern Orthodox Jews were successful in going to the universities and colleges, were successful in professionalization, entered into all the possible elite careers that there are in the United States, the result was that almost none of them pursued Jewish education as a vocation, or even the rabbinate as a vocation. When your son or daughter has gone through Princeton or Harvard or Yale, and you spent all of that effort in making sure that they get there, you're not prepared for them to come home and say, Mom, Dad, I intend to be a rabbi and a Jewish educator. That's not what you hoped for. The result was, who went into Jewish education? As most day school principals in the United States will tell you today, there's absolutely no problem in filling the desks with students. There isn't a city with a population over 7,000 that doesn't have a day school, at least one day school in it, and there's no problem in filling the desks. The real problem, as every day school principal will tell you, is finding Judaica teachers for those students. But who is there? Who pursued chinuch? Who pursued the rabbinate? People from the religious right. And so they became the teachers in these day schools. And of course, they didn't share the agenda, the worldview of the rest of the laity, of the parent body, or of those children, the homes from which they came. And so in a sense, in a subtle way, these Judaica teachers, and I'm not talking about the ones who came from Israel, because the ones who came from Israel had their own problems. They didn't really understand. It's sort of a, you'll hear Gary Rosenblatt talking about Israeli politicians not understanding America. I can assure you that many of the Israeli teachers who came into the day schools didn't understand America any better. Even less, right. There was huge cultural problems there. So by and large, what happened in the day schools is that the Jewish education was suddenly in the control of people who did not share the worldview, the background, the agenda of modern Orthodoxy, and could not help but be what we might call agents provocateurs, undermining that view of the Jewish future. In fact, you can see this in a whole variety of institutions, maybe in the most dramatic way in Yeshiva University. Yeshiva University, which the old joke used to be, it's not a yeshiva and it's not a university. Yeshiva University is an institution, in a sense, torn against itself. If you go to the Beis Medrash, you will see, and I'm saying this not only in the college, but in the high school as well, you will see there are really two institutions here, with the Old Torah and the New Math, but the Old Torah is, in a sense, overwhelms the math, overwhelms the modern world. In addition to which, it wasn't just in the Judaica faculty, but in those who chose to be in the rabbinate. Increasingly, Orthodox rabbis in modern Orthodox synagogues were not people who had gone through the same college experience, did not any longer have the same enthusiasm for being part of American culture, were much more, to use the vernacular, they were much blacker than their congregation. Something had happened here that was striking for modern Orthodoxy. Modern Orthodoxy in its early years